Great. Well, welcome. It's good to have you here for session 12, looking at chapter 11 from our How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. So, yeah, thanks for tuning in at home and thanks for being here in person. It's good to join you today and be together for this. Um, we're looking at Psalms, and I wanted to start by reading Psalm 1, since it really does not only introduce us to the time and to the book, but it sort of does introduce. It's part of the introduction for the whole book of Psalms. Psalm 1. Blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, or stand in the way of sinners, or sit in the seat of mockers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night. He is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever he does prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked shall perish. I did memorize that at one point, but need a refresher. I wouldn't quite be ready to recite it all for you just off memory. But anyway, so we're looking at Psalms, Israel's prayers and ours. That was the author's title. And the author gets into it and starts from the beginning to remind us that the Bible contains words from God to people. But that as we look at the Psalms, this is a little bit of a reverse. That the Bible also contains words spoken to God or about God, and these are God's word too. So it's not just a book telling us with God's word to us, words from God to people, but actually the book of Psalms is meant to coach us through prayer and through singing on how we can approach and talk with and to God. The Psalms are profitable for helping us to express ourselves to God and to consider God's ways. So, just some of those good reminders right as we get into the book of Psalms about its purpose. As a distinct kind of literature, Psalms require special care in reading and interpreting. In this case, the reader will need to understand their nature, their various types, as well as their forms and functions. And so it is a unique kind of literature within the Bible. There's a lot of narrative. We talked about some of the epistles in the New Testament. We've talked about the covenant. We've talked about the prophets. And now we come to, and even the prophets dealt with poetry, but the Psalms are a whole kind of different thing. There is some overlap that the author points out. But the more we understand about their nature and types and forms and functions, the better that we can actually understand the Psalms and get some more out of it. So when we look at the Psalms as poetry, it's Hebrew poetry, which by its very nature was addressed to the mind, but through the heart. You know, one of the things that I'm reminded of again and again is that stories have the power to connect with people in a unique way. That even when you look at presentations for businesses and for wherever it might be, stories, people are learning to integrate stories more and more because they're just so critical. You can give data and facts and have PowerPoint presentations. But in the end, it's story that really connects. And that's part of the purpose of the Psalms, to get through to your mind, but through the heart. That it uses all these different tools of metaphor and hyperbole and just the beautiful language in order to get to our mind and help us understand things. The Psalms themselves are musical poems for the most part. And the vocabulary of poetry is purposefully metaphorical. So we're reminded to not take them literally. I liked his example in there of Psalm 23, how most of us have heard it, and maybe even some of us have memorized it, or you've heard it at a funeral or something. But he sort of points out to be like, yeah, most of us also don't work with sheep at all, so we don't really know how dumb they are. And they're really, really stubborn. And, you know, being a shepherd uh, wasn't like a noble and highly esteemed job. It was usually for the youngest kid or the one who wasn't quite as bright. And the sheep are like in and of themselves a whole nother, So when we read Psalm 23, like being compared to a sheep is not necessarily like a real flattering uh, metaphor. And I thought about that too because I have been to Ireland, and I remember walking through one of the pathways up in the hills there, and you see the sheepdogs work, and man, that is phenomenal to see. And there's a guy, and the farmer was on a quad, and he'd just call out a word or whistle a certain way, and the dog would come boom, and he'd come bombing around the other side, and he'd chase all those sheep and get them all coming this way, and then they'd start to go off in the other. Another whistle, and the dogs come whipping around again, get them going the other side. Like, man, that was incredible to see. But the whole point is that sheep are not easy to work with. And when the Psalms or when the Bible compares us with that, we're like, oh, yeah, sometimes we can be. But we have to remember that the vocabulary is purposefully metaphorical. And so don't take things too literally. When we look at the Psalms as literature, Psalms of several different types. As you go through, there's different types of Psalms. There's 150 of them, after all. Each Psalm is also characterized by its formal structure. So each type of Psalm is intended to have a given function in the life of Israel. So they had different purposes, as we will get to and see that they were written for different reasons. There are also various patterns within the Psalms. Sometimes sometimes this is where we really miss it in translation. We're reading it in English, not in Hebrew, and we don't understand that language, and so, we don't get to pick up on the nuance or the word plays of the authors. And so, one of the examples is Psalm 119, that it's actually an acrostic and goes through the whole Hebrew alphabet, and each of those sections starts with the letter of that alphabet. And so, again, remember, poetry is also a literary device. It makes things easier to memorize. In a society that's not literate for the most part, you want to make things sticky, right? You want people to retain it, to understand it. And so, good grief, if you look at Psalm 119, it's the longest psalm in the whole Bible. Like, it's huge. But you could, if it was A, B, C's, you could think A, and you could memorize that section. B, you memorize that section. C, you memorize that. Like, it does help you to your mind to sort of logically find handles. The other thing is like puns, word plays and things like that. And Jesus used some of these too, and we miss them when we don't do the research, right? But in the poems and the Psalms, it's the same. Some of those words they're really close, but it helps to have some of those study tools and anyway, just pointing out that there's patterns there within the Psalms. And each song or psalm has its own integrity as a literary unit. And again, we are encouraged to read them as a whole, like not to just be taking out a verse here and there. Psalms are to be treated as wholes and not just chopped up, because that's the context, right? In the epistles in the New Testament, we were strongly encouraged to read the whole thing in one sitting to get the whole kind of swath of and scope of the letter. And then when you break down into paragraphs, you can have a better understanding. Well, the Psalms, it's a smaller piece, unless it's Psalm 119. But it's to read the whole thing and get the gist of it, get the meat of it, and because there is actually a whole theme per psalm. Like So what is it? We got to read through it and repeat that to get it, not just chop it up into little verses. The use of psalms were functional. They were functional songs composed for use in worship by the ancient Israelites. Functional means that they served the crucial function of making connections between the worshiper and God. So there are 5 books of Psalms. Again, this was pointed out in that sort of introductory video and from the Bible Project, how to read the Psalms. But this is how it's broken down. Book 1, Psalms 1 to 41, 2, 42 to 72, 3, 73 to 89, 4 is 90 to 106, and 5 is 107 to 150. Again, there was a little bit of a highlight there in that video that pointed out that Psalms 1 and 2 are really an introduction to the whole book, and then actually the last 5 Psalms. So uh, basically 146 to 150 would actually be sort of a conclusion, a little segment of concluding Psalms in the whole book. It is not possible to discover the date that most of the Psalms were written. However, they have a universal quality. The reason why we bring this up is because, especially in the New Testament, we've been encouraging you to dig into the context. And in the Old Testament too, to be able to place the book historically and say, when did this happen? What else was happening in that time? What else was happening in the world at that time? Or in Israel at that time? But with the Psalms, we really don't have that. The ones that are written by David, we can, or at least described to him, we can assume were written by him, and they would have been a little earlier. But it's also likely that some of these Psalms were written later, either in exile or after exile, or summarized. So we don't really know when they were all written, but it almost doesn't matter as much with the Psalms because they stand alone so well and they have such a universal quality. The language and the imagery, the purpose of the Psalms, it's just unlike any other literature in the Bible. After the Israelites returned from exile and rebuilt the temple, the book of Psalms was apparently made into a formal collection, almost like a temple hymnal, according to this author. So here's a number of the types of psalms. We have laments. Does anybody have an idea of what a lament is? Or could you describe that? Yeah, tends to be like a sad pouring out of emotion. Yeah. Yeah, it's really they're they're good for grieving. And that's often when they were used, grieving some loss, right? And so there's psalms of lament that are either individual, it could be a person who's sharing that, or it could be meant for corporate use. I think about things too. As a church goes through difficult times, there could be some psalms that could be used as a church congregation for the corporate use as we think about what God is doing and acknowledging the grief. And it's one of the things that we just don't do well in our culture, right? We want to get through it. It's hard to acknowledge grief. But psalms of lament can help give words and shape to that. There's also thanksgiving psalms. Doesn't mean you have to sing them when your Thanksgiving holiday is, but it just means that they convey the giving of thanks to God. Hymns of praise, acknowledging who God is and worshiping Him, extolling Him, lifting up His name. Salvation history. So there's psalms that go through and they recount the story of the Exodus. They recount the things that God has done in the past life of Israel, of the covenant. Remember, this builds on previous chapters where we learned about the covenant. All of Israel's life is within the covenant. They're the covenant people of God. And so it's really important for them to tell that salvation history, how God has saved them. And God worked those in so that the calendar and the festivals and the feasts and everything in the Jewish year revolved around the memory of who God is, this salvation history. And so the Psalms have a number of them that represent that and tell those stories. There are Psalms of celebration and affirmation. There are Psalms of wisdom, things that we can actually learn and glean from the Psalms that give us wisdom. And songs of trust, putting our hope in God, putting our trust in God. In spite of the circumstance, God, I will trust you. And so these are the types of Psalms. They use a couple of examples. The first was Psalm 3, a psalm of lament. You know, as I read through that, it was resonating with me in some new ways, in some fresh ways. And I really did appreciate that. I think I'll read it here because it's fairly small. I'll read Psalm 3 for us. It says that it's a psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. O Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you are a shield about me, O Lord. You bestow glory on me and lift up my head. To the Lord I cry aloud, and he answers me from his holy hill. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear the tens of thousands drawn up against me on every side. Arise, O Lord, deliver me, O my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw. Break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessing be on your people. So through that, we have this pattern of address. There's a complaint. There's an expression of trust. There's a declaration and a call for deliverance. And then there's an assurance and a praise. And I liked how the author in our book pointed out how the expression of trust actually comes before the cry for deliverance. You know, I thought that was pretty neat. You are a shield about me, O Lord. You bestow glory on me and lift up my head. You know, he goes on about God's goodness. I will not fear. I know you can handle this, God. Arise, O Lord, deliver me. Strike all my enemies on the jaw and break their teeth. Break the teeth of the wicked. And then there's praise, right? From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessing be on your people. So anyway, it's kind of neat to see the patterns there and just see how they work through. The second example was a psalm of thanksgiving in 138. I won't read that one, but it has a similar progression. But it has an introduction, distress, an appeal, a deliverance, and a testimony. And so we can see patterns within the Psalms as we look at them. And so that's where I would encourage you to come back to the book and the note sheet even, and just be reminded of some of these patterns, and even to look for them as you read. Then there are the imprecatory Psalms. Probably a new word for you, which imprecatory means to invoke or call down curses. Again, these are some of the Psalms where you think, is that really a godly thing to say? Almost like that coming like, punch him in the mouth, Lord. Bust his jaw. You're like, that doesn't sound really like the rest of the Bible. Or like it doesn't sound like Jesus. But the imprecatory Psalms, as he points out, they guide or they channel our anger to and through God, verbally rather than to anyone or at anyone else, verbally or physically. So it's a great thing to know that our God can handle our anger. That when we're mad, that we can actually pray to him, that we can actually read these Psalms and feel those feelings as visceral and real as they are, and that it can channel it through him, and it's a safe place. That it's safe to vent that to God. And it's safer to channel our anger to and through God than to anyone else. Anyone else that gets our anger, look out. And it could do permanent damage. But with God, he can handle it. Why deny that we sometimes have such anger toward others? Again, this is part of, I would even say, mental health. To pretend that we don't get angry or to pretend that everything's okay is not helpful. It's not true. It's not authentic and it's not real. But then the question is, how does a Christian handle their anger? What are we supposed to do with it? How do we struggle through that? Well, I would say one of the tips here, one of the nice things is find one of those imprecatory psalms that can be yours to keep it in your wallet or on your phone as a note or somewhere where you're like, when you get ticked off or something really makes you angry, you can go to that one and it can express and give voice to what you're feeling. Better than denying that we have anger. Through these psalms, God invites us, in your anger, do not sin. Right? He acknowledges, yeah, we have anger. This is real. But don't sin. There's a way to handle it. Give it to me. Tell it to me. We are expressing our anger directly to and through God rather than seeking to return evil to those who have done evil to us. Remember, one of the hardest things for us, and we're so far removed of it, but one of the things that I don't think it would necessarily be easy for the Israelites to do, but there's the reminder that in the Old Testament, again and again, God says, vengeance is mine. It's not yours, it's mine. Leave it to me. I'll handle it. I know the bigger picture. I know what I'm trying to accomplish. I hear your anger. You have a right to be angry. God might even say, I'm angry too. That ticks me off as well. Sometimes the anger is righteous. There's injustice. There's harm. There's things that are happening. But we're called to bring it to God. And the Psalms help us do that rather than seeking to return evil to those who have done evil to us. That's the easiest thing in the world. To say eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth. Jesus points out, that's one of his tough teachings, right? Don't just love your friends and the people who do good to you. Everybody does that. Even the criminals do that. Thieves will scratch each other's backs. I'm telling you, love your enemies. Do good to those who persecute you. You're like, well, I think that was a hyperbole. That was an exaggeration. I don't think Jesus really wanted us to love our enemies. I mean, doesn't he know what they did to me? But the Psalms can help. Because in the Psalms, we find real life experiences. I mean, when you read what David went through, right, and he's crying out to God and his anger and his frustration. I mean, the psalm we read, that was his son chasing after him to murder him. Any of you had sons trying to murderously chase you through the countryside? No, not yet. Praise the Lord. So, I mean, like David knew what he was talking about. He was running away when the king was hunting him. King Saul was hunting him, and he was in the middle of the desert fleeing for his life. God, protect me, save me, redeem me. I trust you, but what's going on here? And then you have, even with the conviction of sin, after the prophet Nathan goes and points, you are the man. And David's like, oh. His confession and his crying out to God, forgive me, cleanse me, make me white as snow. So they're just so powerful for us to come to and to find a shared human experience. The Psalms are just so beautiful for that. In other areas we may not find it, but there you find there is a psalm that you can relate to at almost any time in your life. Joy or pain, high or low, whatever it might be. There's a psalm for that. Imprecatory psalms, to keep going here. The imprecatory psalms do not contradict Jesus' teaching to love our enemies. We tend wrongly to equate love with having a warm feeling toward, but Jesus defines love actively. It's not so much how you feel about a certain person, but what you do for that person that shows love. The Bible commands us to do love rather than to feel love. So That's just that reminder. We're called to do love, to act, not just to feel love. Because feeling love is really hard. Even, I mean, if you've been married, you know that. When you love your spouse, yes, I love my spouse. Yes, I've always loved my spouse. We have this many years together. I love them. But you know that in the day to day or the interactions or when you're in the car, certain things happen or whatever. I mean, it's not always the feeling of love. And that's even when I talk with couples in premarital counseling. There's a bit of that reminder to be like, hey, it's not this whole thing that you're getting into. This isn't just all about having a nice feeling of love, because sometimes that fades, or sometimes you have fights, or sometimes you get angry. But it's about doing love. What do we do? And even back to that scripture of be angry but do not sin, or in your anger do not sin. To be like, yeah, you'll be angry, and it's even okay to be angry, but don't sin, don't act it out, because you could still be angry and loving. You know what I mean? Like, I could still be loving you and angry, but if I handle my anger properly, that's the loving thing to do. Not pretending it doesn't exist. Anyway, the biblical command is to do love rather than to feel love. The term hate, quote unquote, hate in the book of Psalms has been commonly misunderstood. Well, in some context, or while in some context, it may mean despise, like when we think of it as hate, as in I hate you, I despise you. It can also mean be unwilling or unable to put up with, or to reject. So, I mean, in one example would be like when he says to hate sin. It could mean despise, but it could also be to be unwilling or unable to put up with, or with a person, or with the actions that that person is doing. And oftentimes God has that type of thing or description for injustice, for cruelty, for harm of the weak, the poor, the widow, the orphan. God hates when they are mistreated. It could be despised, or it could be unwilling and unable to put up with, or reject that as legitimate behavior. The Psalms can serve as a guide to worship. The three basic benefits of the Psalms. The Psalms can serve as a guide to worship. The Psalms demonstrate to us how we can relate honestly to God, which is really helpful. Especially when we're so frustrated or so angry or so sad or so happy that we just can't find the words. They're there. And third, the Psalms demonstrate the importance of reflection and meditation on that which God has done for us. So we have that sort of just recap of those three reasons of why the Psalms are important, why they're useful, why they benefit us. They guide us to worship, they help us to relate honestly with God, and they demonstrate the importance of reflection and meditation on what God has done for us. It's good. It's good to recall the things God has done for us, and we need to make time for that. And we do that sometimes, hopefully in our own lives and families, and maybe through prayer or journaling or other rituals you have in your family. But anyway, the Psalms can be employed in that as well. So, just a reminder that next week we won't be meeting here because we have our district general AGM for the Church of God in Western Canada, and it's a big Zoom call. So that's scheduled for the same time as when we have our class. So we won't be meeting here next week, but we'll pick it up the week afterwards with wisdom then and now. So thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you then.